Not one fucking horn from any of them. Hello everyone, it's me, the Fat Controller himself, FnafFan Productions here. And today is going to be a very different video. Not really something you would normally expect from me. So today, as you can see, I am not in my usual habitat. I have actually decided to come outside to record this video. More specifically, I'm actually recording this video on this local railway footbridge not far from where I live. I decided to record on my local railway footbridge because I thought it would be rather fitting to do so, especially for the topic of today's video. So yeah, you've read the title already, obviously, but this year is a special year because this year, 2025, is officially going to be the year where our new winter fuel allowance thieving, tax rising, left-wing Labour governments are going to finally start renationalising our railways after more than 30 years of privatisation. So to those who have no idea what I'm talking about, I'm just gonna fill your head with a little bit of context. So unlike many other countries in Europe and Asia, our railway system in the UK is a private system, where it basically means that corporations and companies own it instead of the state. Well, more or less anyway, in the case of Britain. Now, a private railway system in the 21st century anyway is not a new concept. Other countries like Brazil, Greece, and more or less Australia also have adopted a private railway network. Now, our railways in the UK wasn't always private. From 1948 to 1997, our railways were completely controlled by the government under the state-owned British Rail. But then, in 1993, it was broken up, and then it was completely privatised in 1997, not by Margaret Thatcher, by the way. It was actually her successor, John Major. A lot of people thought it was Thatcher, but no, it was actually John Major who did it.
The more you know.
So after British Rail was completely sold off in the 1990s, the railways were now in the hands of private companies. Over the years, several successor governments would create state-owned companies that would oversee several aspects of the railway industry. But overall, it was completely in the hands of the private sector. Until now, that is, as our new Labour governments have announced that the railways will be renationalised under the new state-owned organisation, Great British Railways. Because putting in the word great in the name is somehow gonna make things better, apparently. So seeing as I'm a British citizen, born and raised here, what are my thoughts on privatisation? Were the railways any good under privatisation? And was it any better than it was run by British Rail? Fuck no. Absolutely not. It was just complete shit. Like I'm sorry, there's no better way to describe it. It was just absolute shit. Now, as some of you may or may not know, I made a documentary last year about privatisation, and in it I did a rant a little bit about why privatisation failed. But I felt like I never really went into too much detail looking back on it, so I'm going to provide my full rant here right now. So, in my opinion, I think privatisation of our railways was overall a failed experiment. And yes, to all of the retards watching this video and are just screaming in their screens,
privatisation is better, British Rail is better.
Okay, yes, I will admit you are right. Privatisation was better in some aspects. Privatisation did give us some benefits, like newer, faster and cleaner trains. Yes, I completely agree with that. But overall, privatisation was just a complete dumpster fire. It was supposed to bring a lot more changes to the railways, but it failed to deliver all of them. Privatisation promised cheaper fares for passenger rail. That was complete bullshit. Fares are incredibly expensive, way more than what British Rail charged you. Privatisation also promised that less taxpayers' money would be invested into the railways as well. That was fucking bullshit as well. So much more taxpayers' money is being spent on the railways now. Way more than how much was being invested back in the days of British Rail. I guess what all of that money goes to? Does it go into building new trains or anything like that? No. Wanna know where most of that money goes into? Paying the private companies. Even though that the railways right now are in the hands of the most successful, quotations, and wealthiest companies in the private sector, taxpayers' money is still being spent on the railways. It makes sense, doesn't it? Oh, but surely the private company spends their money responsibly and invest their profits into improving their services, right? No, they fucking don't. There is only one thing that the private sector cares about, and that's profit. They don't care about you or providing a quality service for the people. They only care about making money for their shareholders. That's it. You see, in my opinion, if you wanted to cut taxpayers' money from being spent on the railways by privatising it, why not just not spend any taxpayers' money on the railways and have the private companies pay everything for themselves? Why should you expect the public to pay for something that the public doesn't even own anymore? Like, let's just say, hypothetically... No, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that Ben Shapiro bit where he's all like,
Oh, so let's say, hypothetically.
So let's just say, for argument's sake, that what if your neighbour brought a car, like the most latest Rolls-Royce model, and he doesn't want to pay the insurance, or the maintenance costs, or the fuel costs, and he wants you to pay those costs instead of your neighbour paying the costs himself? Would you say that's unfair? Of course you would, because it's not your car. It hasn't been brought in your name. And I'm sure that if the Prime Minister or MPs were in that same situation, they would say that's unfair too. So why should they expect the public to pay for a service that the public doesn't own anymore? If you're privatising a public sector and then you're taking it into the hands of the private sector, then the private sector should have full financial responsibility. It's basic common sense. And you see, the thing is, this concept where no taxpayers' money is being used to fund private public transport companies does already exist. And those are the open access rail operators. Right, so basically what the open access operators are is that, unlike other train operating companies that are franchised to operate trains in, any region that the Department of Transport franchises to, open access operators don't get franchised by the Department of Transport. They instead have to ask permission to a government office called the Office of Road and Rail if a company can run trains on a rival's track. And if the Office of Road and Rail says yes, then a company can run services on a rival's track. But what makes open access operators more different is that, unlike train operating companies where they are funded by taxpayers' money, open access operators are expected to make their profits completely independently with no taxpayers' money. And if the company goes bust, then they go bust. Tough shit. And guess what? Even though that there is no taxpayers' money being used to fund these companies, open access operators are doing just fine as an independent business. There's only been one single situation where an open access operator went bankrupt. Just once. And that was 14 fucking years ago. It just ultimately shows that the private sector could do just fine with no taxpayers' money being invested into it. So I really don't get why privatization was done in a way that taxpayers' money was still needed in order to invest into it, even though the system was completely private back then. Another issue with privatization was that it also promised better timetables. That wasn't the case at all as well. Trains to this day are barely punctual and are always late. Privatization also promised to create a competitive railway network. That also more or less hasn't been the case as well. There hasn't been any proper competition between the many companies. There is some rivalry between them, and some train operating companies are in a competitive market, like Thameslink and East Midlands Railway, battling each other on their services from London to Luton Airport in terms of prices. But overall, most train operating companies are just generating a monopoly for themselves in many regions with no competition. The railway system we have now, in terms of their functionality, is more or less the same as it was run by British Rail. Privatisation was also done in a very disorganised and a very confusing way. When British Rail was finally sold off in 1997, the railway industry was divided into many different types of sectors that companies would be in charge of. It was divided into track and track maintenance, and the larger railway stations like terminals. Then you had passenger train operating companies, or TOCs, that would basically operate services, set out fares, and maintain their rolling stock, as well as hiring train drivers and owning the smaller stations. Then there are rolling stock leasing companies, where they own trains of various classes and modes of traction, and they are where a TOC would basically come up to them and say, "Hey, can we borrow that?" And then the leasing firm would basically just say, "Yeah, sure, just pay us some money and give them back to us after a few years." Then there are private freight companies, which is, pretty self-explanatory. They're responsible for the transportation of goods. And then there was catering, which would handle things. Okay, I'm a fucking mess. And then there was catering, which would handle things like food or cleaning. And then the Department of Transport would oversee everything and can have the right to strip the company of their assets and operations should any private company step out of line. There was just many types of different sectors created in the railway industry. And the thing is, John Major's government never really knew how to privatise British Rail. Privatisation first began in 1993. At that time, no other country in the world had ever privatised something incredibly large and complicated like the railway industry. Even John Major had said himself that he regretted the way he privatised British Rail by separating the train operations and track maintenance into different companies. Although quite recently, I discovered a different option that would have made privatisation even more simpler. You see, a couple of days before I decided to record this video, I was actually watching an old documentary about the privatisation of British Rail from the 1990s, and I saw something that was really interesting to me. So in my documentary about Royal Mail's mail trains, I briefly talked about something called sectorisation. So before British Rail was privatised, in the mid-1980s, the many different services within British Rail, like commuter rail, intercity rail, freight rail, and mail train operations, were divided into business sectors. So instead of operating within the ownership of the British Rail Board with one brand, they were now given their own brands, their own chairmans, their own trains, their own assets, and own stations to own for themselves. But they were still under the control of the British Rail Board itself. So every decision or improvements that the business sectors wanted to make would still have to be up to the British Rail Board itself to decide. And in that documentary I was watching, there was an interview with the chairman of British Rail himself at that time, Bob Reid, and he said he actually welcomed privatisation, believe it or not, but what he wanted was to have the British Rail Board itself gone and have the business sectors complete control and operate as private companies. That, in my opinion, would have made a whole lot more sense to do, especially because of the fact that the sectors were practically already running as their own companies anyway. But no, that didn't please the idiots in power, so instead they ignored Bob Reid's opinions and opted for the complete privatisation of British Rail instead, and we're now stuck with the shit mess that we now have. So yeah, I really don't like our privately run railways in the UK. It is just a broken mess and it has overall failed. It was nothing more but a complete ideological idea made by rich right-wing wankers who have never travelled on trains before and had no idea on what else they could do to fix it. Period. But hey, a new left-wing Labour government has been elected. Railway privatisation is getting booted. Who gives a shit? Let's now get into the real reason why I wanted to make this video, and that is the establishment of the new statement organisation for the railways, Great British Railways, starting in May. So what are my thoughts about Great British Railways? What are my overall thoughts? Well, it's great that a government has actually realised that privatisation has sucked ass, but Great British Railways, in my opinion, is definitely not a great idea. No pun intended. So back in my documentary about rail privatisation, I did talk about Great British Railways and I did discuss my overall opinions about it before. But again, I never really went into too much detail, although saying that, there really was not a lot of info about Great British Railways at that time. So now that 2025 is here and the bills to establish Great British Railways have gone through Parliament and more info about it has been revealed, have my opinions about Great British Railways changed? No, in all honesty. Okay, so to those who don't know, here is a bit of context. So in my documentary, I said that I don't like the idea of Great British Railways. I thought that the overall concept of it does not go far enough. It isn't aiming to wipe out all of privatisation completely, and it has too many logistical and economic problems that will definitely affect it in the long run. So what this new Labour government are basically planning to do is that they are only going to bring passenger rail and network rail into public ownership under Great British Railways, but freight, manufacturing and rolling stock leasing companies won't be nationalised. They will continue to be in the private sector. And open access operators, like what I discussed earlier, will continue to operate, but according to the Department of Transport, they will continue to operate as long as they will add value and capacity to the network, meaning that they probably will be subjected to regulation on where they can or cannot access the network, which is, you know, fair enough, I guess. Now, I get why manufacturing isn't being nationalised, in my opinion. It would be way too expensive and costly to bring manufacturing under a nationalised organisation again. And plus, a lot of state-owned railways in Europe do rely on private manufacturing nowadays. Hardly any country actually builds its own trains now. But what really raised my eyebrows was that it wouldn't renationalise the rolling stock leasing companies. Rolling stock leasing companies charge money for operators to use their trains. And it's not like hiring a car for a couple of £100. Rolling stock leasing companies charge millions for train operating companies to use their trains. So what if Great British Railways is like suffering from a lack of funding and they can't afford to lease certain trains? Will there be like some sort of emergency funding to cover that? Or will they just not have to lease any new trains? If that will truly be the case, then that will be complete chaos. You're just going to end up with massive rolling stock shortages, which will then lead to frequently cancelled trains. And if you're wondering that why not Great British Railways can just purchase new trains and keep them for themselves, well, they can't do that either. If a train operating company wants to purchase new trains, then by law, it has to go into the ownership of a leasing firm. And because of the fact that Labour is nationalising passenger rail as the contracts of all the passenger rail companies expire one by one instead of just nationalising them all at once, so that way the government won't have to pay them in compensation, a lot of train operating companies are still going to be around, so naturally they would want trains too. And since Great British Railways is technically going to function the same way as a passenger rail company, they'll have to follow the same laws put in place for the private companies. So no, Great British Railways can't just buy new trains and keep them for themselves to fix rolling stock shortages. Because if they want new trains, they'll have to go to the leasing firms by law, so that way the remainder private companies can lease them too. I can get the overall reasons why they won't, renationalise rolling stock leasing, because obviously, like I said before, some train operating companies are still going to be around until their contracts expire and then get into the control of GBR, as well as open access operators and freight rail. But what gets me really ticked off about this is that why can't Great British Railways just, I don't know, own all of the rolling stock, locomotives and trains and do the leasing themselves? If Great British Railways could take over the rolling stock leasing companies and lease their trains to private companies with charges, they can bring in huge sums of money along with their rail fares, and they can use that money to improve the railways. It's that easy of a problem to solve. Oh yeah, but wait, rolling stock leasing companies make a huge profit. Well, bugger, how stupid of me. We can't get rid of the most profitable assets in our beloved private sector, am I right? Labour's rail renationalisation plan is nothing more but a complete mess. It is vaguely explained, and it is hardly going to reverse all of the issues that the private sector has caused to our railways. But hey, it is what it is. The bills have been passed. Great British Railways will begin to be established this year, starting in May, as the first passenger rail company contracts begin to expire, starting with South Western Railway. I doubt that anything is going to change with these plans in all honesty. But if Great British Railways goes bust or suffers a rolling stock shortage, don't say I didn't warn you. That's all I'm saying. So yeah, that's all I have to say about my opinions on the Labour government's rail renationalisation plan. Now, I don't normally do political commentary content at all, but I felt like it was the right time to share my thoughts on the whole nationalisation plan and reflect on how shit our railways were. But what did you think? Do you think Great British Railways is a bad idea too? Or do you think it's a great idea? If so, then feel free to let me know in the comments below. Be sure to like, share and subscribe. Follow me on Instagram and Threads. Join my Discord server. Invite link is in the about page and also in the pinned comments. And I shall see you all in the next video. So yeah, I'm going to go home now because it's fucking cold. I'm freezing my tits off. So yeah, I'm gonna go home now. Yeah, still working on the Five Nights at Freddy's Final Hours retrospective. I promise.